All right. Cool. All right. Hi, everybody. Happy November. How's life going? Yeah? A month from now, you ready to be at home eating, I don't know, cookies or whatever it is you do? Yeah. Okay. So close. So close, people. Um, I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but we're gonna just get started. I know that normally we just take a week per chapter, but I really like this chapter, so we're gonna finish it up today. I know we had it all last week as well. The next chapter on chromosomes, basically what it says is, hey, all this genetic stuff, it's happening because of chromosomes. So that's nice, but 2 days will be plenty enough time for it. On Friday, we talked about some of the exceptions, or not exceptions, but some of the interesting cases with genetics, right? So instead of just having 2 alleles, you can have lots of alleles, right? Instead of having complete dominance, you can have incomplete dominance. Today we're finishing up some of these like funky bits. One idea is something called pleiotropy. That's where on Friday we saw that you could have lots of different alleles for the same trait, right? So you have allele A or B or O, right? This one is saying, hey, well, some genes, yes, do like this gene does purple pigment, and that's the only thing it does, that's it. Most genes do lots of things. So most genes have lots of phenotypic effects. So the gene for cystic fibrosis messes around with an ion channel, and ion channels are all over the place. So this gene, if you have 2 recessive cystic fibrosis alleles, what you end up having is you end up having funky ion transport, which means you build up mucus in your lungs, you build up mucus in your gut, basically anywhere that you need the ion channel, there's an effect. So it's not just like, this means purple. Okay with that? This idea is just saying, one gene can have lots of effects. Fair enough? So there's a gene for, I don't know, this or that enzymatic protein. You see it throughout the body. So far, so good? Okay. The next one is my just favorite part of today. You know, labs like the dog, what colors do they come in? They come in yellow, black, brown sometimes, right? Yeah, okay, so you're expecting yellow, black, or brown. Fair enough? Cool. So you see that and you're like, ha ha ha, I will figure stuff out. You can make a couple assumptions. You can assume like, okay, well maybe what's going on is maybe there are multiple alleles, right? There's a black allele, and there's a brown allele, and there's a yellow allele. You can imagine that, right? And that could work if that's how it's set up. Fair enough? Or you could think, maybe there's some sort of incomplete dominance, right? Where like black is dominant, yellow is recessive, and then brown's the incomplete version, right? You see that. It's actually neither of those things. It's still controlled by genetics, and it's beautiful. It's a clever example of something called epistasis, which is just saying one gene is going to change how another gene is expressed. Okay? So it's not multiple allelic forms. So like in blood, you've got different forms, right? You have A or B or O, right? Different versions of the same gene meaning different things. In this one, you've got 2 different genes doing different things. So for labs, you have a gene that does pigment, right? The allele for capital B, the big B, is the allele that's responsible for black pigment production, right? If you have that allele, you make black pigment. If you have the recessive one, the little b, you make brown pigment. And it's a complete dominant situation. If you have two little b's, you make brown pigment. If you have 2 big B's, you make black pigment. If you have one big B and one little b, you make both black and brown pigment, but because you have black, you don't see the brown. So far, so good? But you'll notice you've got black as dominant, brown as recessive, and there is not a pigment for yellow. Yeah? What happens is the genes doing pigments are doing their thing. They're doing pigments. There's also a gene, we're calling it with alleles E, that's responsible for, can I take the pigment from the cell and deposit it on the hair? All right? If you have the dominant form, yes, you can pick up the pigment and put it in the fur. If you don't have at least one of those dominant alleles, you can make orange pigment, you can make purple pigment, doesn't matter. The organism can't take that pigment and put it in the fur. Do you see that? So then you end up with something like this. If you have two heterozygote black labs that look like that, they're heterozygote for both the pigment color and pigment deposition, which is just saying putting pigment on. You have something like this happen, right? So, online folks, we see that we've got an everybody. We see that there are a bunch of black labs, some brown labs, and some yellow labs, right? And we'll see, like, this buddy right here. Does this dog make black pigment? Absolutely, right? This dog makes black pigment. Makes black pigment, right? It just can't get that pigment to its fur. This dog does not make black pigment and can't get it to fur. It makes brown pigment but can't get it to its fur. This one right here. We're okay with that? This dog, let's see, we'll look at this one right here. This brown dog right here. That brown dog right there makes brown pigment and gets it to its fur just fine. So far, so good? Ooh. Sneaky questions. If you were to cross this dog and this dog, if you were to cross, online people, this dog and this dog, all of their children would be what color? Black. Do you see that? And neither parent's black, but you'd get, from, if this is the mother, from the mother you'd get the brown allele. From the father you'd get the black allele. From the mother you'd have to get the deposit pigment, and from the father you wouldn't, so it'd all be black. You see that? Bless you. If you were to cross something like this, right, you'd have half of your dogs be, so you could either get this allele or this allele for pigment color, but since you're getting one of this or this from the other one, they'd have to all make black pigment, and half of them would show it, and the other half wouldn't. So you'd have half black, half yellow. You see that? It gets funky because it's the same rules apply as have always applied, right? That each of these, if these sort independently, each of these options are equally likely for sperm. Each of these options equally likely for eggs. When they combine, what happens? But now, what the genotype of one allele is going to make a phenotypic difference for the expression of the other gene. So far, so good. This happens a bunch, which is why it gets kind of exciting and complicated. And if you want to go into genetics, you could spend a lot of time being like, okay, if this, and that, but not this, and you make these like these computer programs to figure out like, okay, what's actually going down. So far, so good. This is the idea of epistasis. So, do we need any more on this, or we're doing okay? We're a fast class. All right. There are some things in biology that come in like obvious categories, right? You have either black or brown or yellow labs. You have either purple or not purple pea plants. But there are some things that don't come in like yes and no versions, right? Any inherited trait you have that's somewhat along a continuum? Question, do people come in like short people and tall people? That's it? Like, those are your two options? No, tell me more. Okay, sorry, people are staring at me. Yes, there's a range, right? Like you can go from very, very short to very, very tall, kind of anywhere in between. And you're kind of aware that, like, yeah, it seems like if both parents are tall, it's likely the child's tall. But you probably know tall parents who have like really, really short child, or vice versa. Yeah? Polygenetic inheritance is the idea that there are traits that rely on multiple genes. So poly meaning many genes, right? So honestly, most things that are interesting are going to be polygenetic. Lots of different traits come into it. So say cardiovascular function, something like that. It's not one gene causes this, right? The example we're going to use, and this is the example we used in lab, skin color. Skin color actually has like at least 12, but we're going to, for this time, pretend it's under the control of 6, right? So if you have mom who's heterozygous, sorry, so got right here, we're just looking at 3, anyways, and 3 here. If mom's heterozygous for each of these 3, and dad heterozygous for each of these 3, right? When these two parents cross, right, if mom gives recessive, 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 which he totally could, and dad gives recessive, 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 which he totally could, their kid could have like Zippo pigment, right? If mom gives her dominant, 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 which he totally could, if dad gives dominant, 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 which he totally could, you could have a kid who's got lots of dark skin alleles, right? These two could be siblings, even though they don't look exactly like their parents. Fair enough? See that? And you can have basically all the ranges in between. Questions about this? The same deal works for height, right? If this person's, say, medium height, and this person's medium height, right? And they've got some alleles that are for tall, 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 short, short, short. It's not exactly how it works, but we're going to pretend. You can have kids that range anywhere from, like, really short to really tall, and any combination in between. You see that? And then this is why you'll end up with, and this is courtesy of a conversation I had with somebody else earlier this week, you can have twins that are like this. These two are twins. They made the news a while ago. And like looking at their familial portrait, you can see that like, yeah, these two parents having this kid is not surprising. These two parents having this kid, also not surprising. But apparently when they were at school, people didn't believe they were twins. Fair enough? Yeah, we're okay with this? Also, sorry, I'm in a great mood because I got more sleep this weekend than I have for like a long time, so like, I'm happy about life, except I'm paranoid about like the plague and the election and so many things. But the sleep thing, I'm feeling good with the sleep thing. So I'm in a good mood. But now I feel like I need to go off on a philosophical soapbox for you. Don't be a racist, Dirk. Yeah? Mendelian genetics is really cool, right? Like, it's cool. You're like, okay. And you can figure puzzles out. You can be like, if we cross this golden retriever with a polka-dotted chihuahua, whew, we're going to have whatever, right? Like, you can get this done. It's been used as a club to be like, my genetics are clearly superior to you all's because this, that, or the other. And that's just dumb. Things like skin color, it's a series of pigmentation genes. And honestly, when you're actually like um, looking at the skin, if you're ever like dissecting a cadaver, it's like the single most um, unimpressive layer. There's like a little tiny layer. We're talking like a millimeter of like where these pigments get deposited. And you're like, are you kidding me? That's all the fuss about whatever. If you're going to go for like some physical trait to like be a jerk to other people about, pick something more interesting. Pick something like the ability to curl tongues, or whether or not you can flare your toes, or something that has more like, I don't know. Don't use genetics as a club to be a jerk. It's bad. Sound okay with this? Great. Thank you. Welcome to my TED Talk. With that, genes are not your destiny, okay? So, you have genetics. This is good, congratulations. Go humanity. It shows you, it gives you the rules for how to make proteins. That's what they do. And honestly, most versions of how to make proteins are all pretty similar, and you're probably fine. So, genes don't mean like, well, I have the gene for just being terrible at directions. Too bad for me. I will never, ever, ever be able to be good at directions. Right? That's not really how it works. There are some diseases that, like, yes, this is completely genetically inherited. Right? Most things that are interesting are going to be both genetics and environment playing together, and usually lots of genetic influences playing together with lots of environmental influences. Are we okay with this? It's called the nature versus nurture. And it's not really a versus because everybody, well, in science it's known it's usually both, right? If you've got some sort of trait that's going to need lots of genes to be expressed, plus a bunch of environmental influences to be expressed, that's called multifactorial. So we're going to talk about this briefly. Something like alcoholism, right? There are genes that make you more prone to alcoholism. It makes it easier to get addicted to alcohol. That's known, totally known. There also are environmental factors that make it more prone to get addicted to alcohol. Fair enough? So, if I have absolutely zero risk factors genetically so if I have absolutely no genetic predisposition to alcoholism, right? But I grow up being raised by a gang and my job is to sell alcohol, and I've got an abusive home life and everything's terrible, and my parents offered me alcohol when I was 4, right? Even if my genetics are like not prone to alcohol abuse, am I at risk for alcoholism? Yeah, right? Cool. Let's say I have all the genetic risk factors for alcoholism. I've got every single gene possible that, you know what, if you drink alcohol, your body's going to be like, I want more, right? Let's say I have every single one of those genes. I somehow lost the genetic lottery. Is there any possible way for me to not have alcoholism? Yeah, how? I have all the risk factors for it genetically. Yeah, right? Like, that's the solution, okay? And I realize most people are somewhere between the two extremes, right? It's called multifactorial inheritance, and it does play a huge role. And it's not always as that extreme. Basically, and sorry, I was gonna draw on the board, but I feel bad for the online folks. Basically, everybody, for most diseases, whether it's type 2 diabetes, whether it's alcoholism, whether for obesity, for a lot of conditions or things, there's a huge genetic component. Schizophrenia, right? And it also doesn't have to be terrible, right? It could be something for like perfect pitch. It could be for intelligence-ish. There's some genetic component. There's a lot of environmental component. The idea is basically there's there's some line someplace that if you cross this, you either have the thing or not, right? You cross this line and you have alcoholism. And how far that line is, like, you get pushed towards it by environmental aspects, right? So if you've got tons of genetic, sorry, this is a weird way to do it. If you've got tons of genetic predispositions to it, you're close to the edge of the cliff. So a little bit and you're over, right? You've got all the genetics for perfect pitch, boom. You've all the genetics for perfect pitch. You're raised by a musical family, boom, you've got it, right? If you have all the genetics for perfect pitch, but your family doesn't believe in the power of music or whatever, you might never get there because it just never shows up, right? Or you're farther away from the edge if you've got different genetics for it. Do we see how that works? So this is, you'll hear things like, this population is more at risk for this, that, or the other. Doesn't mean you have to have it. It just means more likely to be a thing, and it's worth knowing. So far, so good? Sweet. It's called multifactorial. There's also, the example your book uses are these little hydrangea buddies. When you look at these pictures, you've seen these flowers before? They're pretty. They come in like pinks and bluishes. When you look at this, you might be like, okay, maybe there's like that multiple genes playing into what color they are, right? So you've got like 3 of these or 3 of those. No, it's one gene for pigment. But what happens is, if you plant this little hydrangea buddy in neutral soil, the pigment comes out pink. If you plant the exact same plant in alkaline soil and basic soil, the plant comes out blue. So the gene does pigment, but how that works depends dramatically on the conditions that plant's in. Fair enough? Yeah. And this, it's too simplistic for this, but this works for a whole bunch of things, right? So like, maybe you genetically have, higher levels of different hormones that promote aggression, right? People can totally have this. They can have higher levels of hormones that are like, yeah, right? That is not your destiny. That just means like, okay, should I channel this towards being Captain America? Or should I channel this towards being, I don't know, supervillain, right? All it's showing is what your biology is, not what you need to do with your life. Okay, there's enough soapboxy. Should I like get going with actual biology stuff? Everyone's okay with this though? Nature and nurture both important? Cool. Alright. Done with my personal soapbox, but no being a racist jerk or throw rocks at you. Mendelian genetics are beautiful. For all that there's like a whole bunch of environmental factors to worry about, right? The basic rules hold, and they're interesting, especially if you're looking at something like diseases. But humans are terrible for doing genetic research because they take a long time to reproduce, right? You can have like hundreds and thousands of generations of flies before you have like one generation of humans, right? Second of all, they don't produce that many kids, right? One mating, like one pair that has a bunch of children, we're talking what, maybe 4? Like theoretically you could get about 20, but like, 20 is nothing. Small potatoes compared. I know it's been done. Small potatoes compared to like rabbits. Rabbits can have like hundreds, right? And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, you probably shouldn't be doing breeding experiments with humans, right? Like you should feel bad about yourself as a person if you're like, haha, you have purple eyes, you're really tall, get together, right? Like don't do that. Fair enough? But the basic Mendelian rules still work for human genetics. And because you can't do breeding experiments going forward, right? It's frowned on. For good reasons. I'm like, probes being frowned on. Typically people go backwards and do pedigree analyses, or they look at parents and children and cousins across generations. It's actually, my grandpa and all of his siblings died of what's not supposed to be a genetic blood cancer, but they all died of it. And there's, in this next generation, like my mom's generation, there are a couple people who have it as well. And so there's some thought that it's genetic, meaning, I kid you not, at family reunions, researchers from the University of Minnesota show up with clipboards and syringes. I kid you not, like they show up and they're like, hi, there's the potluck. They're like, great, can I take your blood? You're like, sure. Anyways, and what they do is they make these little charts to try and figure it out. They've not figured it out yet, but we haven't had family reunion for a while, so there's that. What they do is you look at people who have the phenotypes and what's going on. Nowadays, people can actually often get the genetics, like the genotype. That's why they show up with the syringes to get blood. But if you don't know that, you can look for phenotypes. So how you read these charts, they're called pedigree analyses. Just some conventions. Conventions, males are represented by squares, just because. Females are represented by circles, again, just because. Whatever thing you're looking at, individuals who have that are going to be shaded, either shaded or cross-hatched, right? This can be a good thing or a bad thing or neutral, but it's just they have the thing we're looking at. A mating's indicated by a horizontal line between two, and then the offspring, the children, are going to be listed in birth order, right? So these two mate, and then they had a daughter, 2 sons, and then their last child was a son. In pedigree analyses as well, if you see a slash through the whole thing, that means the individual's dead, just for the record. That's not always shown, okay? So for this pedigree analysis, we're looking at widow's peak, right? So when your hair is across, if it goes down in a V, or if it's flat across. We're looking at this and we're saying, okay, these are the grandparents, two sisters here, the grandfather up here had a widow's peak, the grandmother didn't. Their first daughter and their last son both had it, these 2 middle sons didn't. This grandparent, on the other side, the maternal grandparents, the grandma had it, grandpa didn't, the mom had it, their first daughter has a widow peak, their second daughter does not. So far, so good? We see this, we can see that, we can look at that without even knowing what the genetics are. We're going to come back to this one in a second. We're going to look at this one, earlobes. I don't know how creepily you stare at people's earlobes, but if you stare at people's earlobes, you'll notice that some people have them attached to the side of the face, and others have them hang loose, right? It's not a super noticeable difference, but it's there. It's genetically determined, so cool. When you look at something like this, and ignore for a moment the F's that are drawn all over that, you can see up here with this first generation of these grandparents, neither of these grandparents had excuse me. Neither of them had attached earlobes, right? No. So we're looking at attached earlobes, right? Neither of them had attached earlobes. Cool. But they had 2 kids who did have attached earlobes. Yeah? And then this mating that we're looking at, neither of these folks have attached earlobes, but they had a daughter who has attached earlobes. So if you're looking at something like that, you're like, huh. Again, pretend you don't see the F's yet. Looking at that, you're like, okay, so parents can not show the trait, and then the offspring does show the trait. Do we think this is dominant or recessive? Recessive, yeah, how come? Yeah, it took a while to show up, right? So if it's recessive, right, you can have both parents who are carriers for the thing, that don't have it, and then you have a child who does have it. Whereas if we go back and we look at the widow's peak thing, is there any child who has this who does not have a parent who shows the same trait? Do you see that? There's no place here where two parents don't have it and then have a kid that does. Do you see that? Because the only way for a kid to get a dominant allele is if they got a dominant allele from one of their parents, right? So if a kid has a dominant allele, one or both of the parents has to show it. Does that make sense? We're okay with that? You could have a parent who has it, or both parents who have it, and have no kids show that dominant trait, that's fine. But if your kid shows the dominant trait, one of the parents has to be showing the dominant trait as well. Right? Because otherwise, how did you get it? Does that make sense? How you can read things like that? Sweet. So you can look at these pedigree analyses and be like, ha ha ha, this, that, and the other. You can do a whole bunch of things. Yeah. Concerns about this? Questions about this? Just to make sure we know how to read these. What's the relationship between this person here, and this person up here? What are they to each other? Cousins, parents, grandparents? What's that relationship? Aunt and niece. Are we okay with that? Right? Just we can read that and be like, okay, it's my dad's sister. Yeah? Great. I realize we're all over the place today, but it's good. So, got time. When we talk about disorders, there are dominant alleles and recessive alleles. Neither are necessarily good or bad, but there are a lot of recessively inherited disorders. Before we talk about why, can we take a moment to think, what happens if you have a dominant allele that is lethal by age 5? Right, so dominant allele, if you have one copy of it, 5's max amount of life. What happens to that allele? Do you get to pass it on? You don't, right? It's rare to have dominant lethal alleles, right? Because if you have one copy of it and you aren't able to pass it on, it doesn't go anywhere, right? Recessively inherited disorders are more common, not because recessive means bad, because often recessive is just fine, it's good. It's just, it's easier for them to stay around, and there's actually another reason too. So recessively inherited disorders are only going to show up if an individual's homozygous for the allele, right? So if you've got a heterozygous individual who has one copy of the dominant and one copy of the recessive, they're carriers, right? They could pass the recessive on, but phenotypically, you don't see it. So far, so good? So, albinism is recessively inherited. In this situation, we had two parents who both, albinism's where you don't put pigment into the skin, nails, hair, that kind of thing. Both parents in this scenario have normal coloring, but they have a daughter who has albinism. Do you see that? Meaning they both have to be carriers, right? Meaning it's this combination with this makes the daughter like that. This with this, there. You see that? These individuals are siblings, so they're not going to intermarry or intermate. But if the daughter who has albinism were to have children with someone who's a carrier for albinism, do all of their kids have it? Do half of their kids have it? Do none of their kids have it? What's going on average? Somebody who had this genotype, someone who has this genotype, how many of their kids have it? Or percentages? Half, right? Because for mom, you're getting either this or this, either way, right? And dad, you're getting this or this. Half, right? What about if someone who had this were to mate with someone who had this genotype, any of their kids have it? All their kids have it? None, right? All the children would be carriers if these two crossed, but none would actually have it. So far, so good? Okay with this? So, things. The part of the class. Oh, I have some of my soapboxy parts. This is the part of the class where I tell you to not marry your siblings. Don't marry your siblings. For like many reasons, but biological reasons too, okay? If you remember nothing else from this class, don't eat people. Cannibalism's bad for prion reasons, for protein denaturing. And don't marry your siblings. It's bad for biological reasons too. Learned so much in college. Okay, so if there's some sort of allele that causes a disease, or a recessive one, if you get two recessives, you have a disease, and the frequency of it's really, really rare, it's unlikely for two people who both have the same rare disorder to meet and to have a child, right? So if there's a 1 in a million recessive allele for this, that, or the other, 1 in a million over here, it's just, the frequency is really low, right? So these recessive alleles that can cause disease exist in the population. It's not a big deal because you probably don't have the same copy as somebody else. However, if close relatives mate, the chance that you both carry the same rare allele goes way up because you both have the same parents or similar genetics. Do you see this? Albinism isn't like deadly, but if siblings, there's a lot more likely that they're carriers for the same thing, right? Basically what it's saying is like, okay, maybe, if you had an individual like, so parent and parent, right? None of these children, so if this was a parent and this was the parent from the original generation, parent to parent, none of the children would have albinism, right? None of them would know that they had some recessive thing going on. But you'd have a lot more likelihood to both have the same recessive allele if those siblings married. So far, so good? Most cultures have some version of don't have close relatives mate. Siblings, it's really bad genetically. Cousins, you can get away with it. Just don't do it for generations and generations and generations. I went down the rabbit hole a while ago just to look up laws in the US. And there are a whole bunch of states that like don't care if you marry your cousin at all. Some states have rules saying absolutely not. And then my personal favorite are the ones that have exceptions. So I think it was West Virginia has like, okay, you can marry your first cousin fine. You can't marry your double first cousin. So like if two brothers marry two sisters, right? Then their children are cousins both ways, right? Don't do that. Don't then yeah. Or Utah had they're like, okay, fine. If you want to marry a cousin, fine, but you both need to be over 50. Basically like, whatever. Once you're both over 50, do whatever you want. I know, right? It's interesting. I think it's interesting. Sorry, the take home from that was recessive disorders occur because two recessive alleles. Yeah? We're going to talk about two of these, the most common for those of European descent and the most common of those for African descent. Most common recessive allele that causes disease that we know about, cystic fibrosis. People heard about this one? It's a lethal genetic disease. It's not super common, but it's not rare. It's about 1 out of every 2,500 people. You need two copies to have cystic fibrosis. You need two recessive alleles. So typically, it's two parents who both of whom are carriers, but they don't know it. Then they have a child who has it. For those of African descent, sickle cell disease is the most common one. It's actually more common. It's about 1 out of 400 who have it. And what happens is if you have the sickle cell alleles, you have blood that's curved, right? This means blood doesn't behave exactly normally. It behaves a little bit funky. Um, if you have one copy of the that recessive that sickle cell trait and one copy of the normal one, you have you don't have sickle cell anemia, but your blood does have both kinds going on, right? Okay. Hold that thought. In biology, you expect that things that lead to death don't get passed on that much, right? Because, like, death, right? But some things, some recessive alleles, so sickle cell or cystic fibrosis, they've hung around for a long time. Any ideas why or how or what? What's happening here? Oh, I know, sorry. I'm sorry, just did the teacher thing that, like, you're not supposed to do. The teacher thing of, like, I'm going to ask a question because I really want to answer it. I really want to answer this one. Okay, so first of all, recessive, if the frequency of that allele isn't super common in the population, the likelihood of two people both being carriers passing on is reasonably low. For some of these that are higher, there's one other thing going on. So in sickle cell anemia, if you have two copies of this, so if you only have red blood cells that are sickled, you're very, very sick. That's a problem. However, if you're heterozygous for this, if you're a carrier for it, you don't have sickle cell anemia, but you're a carrier for it, and you get malaria, malaria is not nearly as deadly because your blood's shaped differently. If you get a bloodborne disease like malaria, you are more likely to survive. So yay for you. So having one copy is really protective. Having two copies is bad, right? Same thing, well, not for malaria, but with sickle cell anemia, with cystic fibrosis. So cystic fibrosis ends up causing mucus buildup. It makes things stickier inside you, which if you have two copies is really bad. But if you're heterozygous for this, you're a carrier for this, and you get cholera, which Europe has had a hard time with cholera, right? They had a hard time with just the keeping pooping water and drinking water separate, right? And cholera is a big deal. If you're a carrier for this, you don't die of cholera as much. So it's helpful, but you just don't want two copies of it. Do you see this? We're okay with it? Great. Questions, comments, concerns so far? We're doing okay? Dominantly inherited disorders so lethal dominantly inherited disorders are rare. The best example is Huntington's, but that one doesn't usually show up. Like, you don't see the phenotype until about 50, well, sometimes 30, but after people have already had children. Usually dominant alleles that cause, instant death are usually a mutation. They don't usually last long times. Questions or concerns? Did okay? Yeah, Huntington's disease. This one's rough. This one's really rough. But most diseases, whether we're talking heart disease, diabetes, we're talking schizophrenia, or anxiety, or cancer, or whatever it is. Also, just for the record, everybody and every family has something that runs the family. Just so you know. That's not like, we don't. If your family says that there's no mental illness that runs the family, they're not good at identifying mental illness. Okay, so okay, I said I was done with soapboxes. I'm not done with soapboxes. I have a new soapbox. Problems with the brain are just as valid biologically as problems with the liver. Are we okay with this? And I have never known somebody who, say, has broken a leg, and everyone be like, have you tried not having a broken leg? But I have known a lot of people who, like, um, if someone has depression, if someone's depressed, they've been like, have you just tried not? Right? I've seen this. And I think part of what the reason is because, like, yeah, like, for anxiety or depression or whatever, right? There are things that can make it worse or better, right? So, like, if you say don't sleep and eat nothing but gummy bears, speaking as somebody who didn't really do anything for Halloween but did get a whole bag of gummy bears, right? Like it's not helpful. But that's not the same thing as actually having depression. Anyways, sorry, I'm not kind of wound up today. I don't know why. Okay, multifactorial diseases. Lots of things play into this. It's complicated. Career ideas. There's a lot to be said that nowadays genetic testing and counseling is totally a thing, right? Like, it's doable, and genetic counselors can help people figure their odds of different things, which leads to some interesting, like, ethical questions. Like, if you know that both you and your spouse are carriers, do you have children, right? Do you not? Like it's, and just because one of the concerns is people sometimes get information, but they don't know how to actually interpret that. So maybe my child has 10 times more likely to have a super rare disease, but maybe 10 times more likely is still like nearly zero. You see that? One that actually kind of worked was, I don't know if I use this one. Okay, I use this one a lot because I actually know something about it. Tay-Shax, the one that does the lysosome problem buildup of lipids, right? It's recessively inherited. That one had been a problem in the Jewish community of New York. That they kept having kids who had this. So a large enough group that it's like totally cool to, mate in amongst yourselves. But the recessive allele was there and it kept showing up. And there totally was a push, I can't remember when, but it was like early, like the 60s, 70s, where they're like, hey, before any of us get married, we're totally doing blood tests on both of you. And before you get like too far with whether or not you want to marry, let's just check. And if you're a carrier for it, maybe you should marry somebody who's not a carrier for it. And they actually like drove this to the ground in their community, which is impressive. Yeah. But it is important to, sorry, I have too many notes, but it's important to remember that just because that each child is an independent event, right? So if you have a 50% chance of doing something, it doesn't mean, if my first child has it, the next child has to, right? Each time it's an independent event. If you have a 1 out of 10, it's not like, well, 10 kids, one has it. Fair enough? Okay. To end on a kind of happy note, there are some concerns, some huge benefits to genetic testing. There's some that like everybody's totally cool with because the ethical considerations are like zilch and the benefits are huge. So there's a recessively inherited disorder called PKU. It's a problem where kids just can't like digest. I think it's protein. I think they digest protein. They digest it weird, and it like kills them. It's not very common at all, but if you have it, and from like birth, you can just live a happy normal life. If you don't know, you die, right? So, with newborn babies, they prick their foot, and they drip their blood, like any hospital in the US is going to do this, drip their blood on a little card. If it shows up with like, oh yep, you have the thing, they're like, hey parents, the kid has the thing. It's saved a ton of lives. It's easy. Most hospitals actually screen for like 10 different things. And you can do the same thing if you do like a home birth. You just go to the lab and they like, it's very sad because they poke your baby in the foot and they drip on the little card. But they screen for like 10 different things. They're like, yep, good to know. This has saved a lot of lives. Questions? We're good. Take-home messages. Genes interact with each other. Lots of genes make complicated things. Racism is bad. Incest is bad. Knowing about biology is good. Anything else I'm missing? Sweet. I know several of you emailed me. Thank you, people who emailed me weird stuff about mastering biology. People with weird stuff mastering biology, keep sending those screenshots. I'm trying. But the due dates are extended. Oh, and on your notes, there's like the take-home message because I realize there's a lot we've covered. So yeah. Okay, bye. Have a great day, life, Monday.